250th celebration, and if you've seen our programs, they cover all sorts of Revolutionary wartime topics. And the next one is music, which is March 22nd. And Hugh, I'm going to skip yours for the moment because it doesn't fit the theme. And then in April, the enslaved here in Westerly. The open house, which I want to give a little bit of advance publicity for, is this year on May 4th, which is Rhode Island Independence Day, except it's really not on the 4th, but it's that weekend, the Renunciation Act. And Hugh and Maureen and I have been working our tails off getting an exhibit ready for the museum house, which will be up all year, on our connection and Joshua Babcock's connection to the Revolutionary War. So a lot of us trustees didn't even know everything we've discovered, right?
We've learned a lot.
Yeah, we're over there.
But today, we are going to learn about colonial kitchens. Maureen is also a trustee at the museum, and she's researched all this and brought over some utensils from the kitchen in the mansion. I want to put in one little plug that she will also talk about. There is still room in this coming Saturday's colonial hearth cooking class, which is not in the museum. But if anybody's interested, see me after the program or whatever.
Ellen does it at her house, and it's a ton of fun. Jan has been, I have been, John has been, Hugh and Dave have
You
been.
and David were there.
It's a ton of fun, but you also learn how they cooked in that period of time, which it wasn't as easy. As Jan and I were saying, where's the KitchenAid mixer? How am I supposed to? There's a lot of prep work.
There's a lot of prep work, that's right. So, and look at, all of them are still here. They didn't set themselves on fire, and they didn't freeze. So, all kidding aside, I think you're going to really enjoy this program, and Maureen, it's all yours.
Thank you. So as Ellen mentioned, all of our programs this year are kind of focused on the Revolutionary War period. I was doing a tour one day in the mansion, and I was standing in the kitchen thinking about dinner, and I was thinking, I wonder how they cooked in that day. Like, how did they actually cook their food? So I started to research it, and I thought, well, I'll do a program on it now that I know a little tiny bit about it. This is from the keeping room in the museum. That's the main hearth in the keeping room. So I've split the program into 3 different sections. We'll talk about an overview of what the colonial era was all about, when it happened, then the food of the colonial era, and then we're going to compare the keeping room to our modern kitchens and how they cooked then versus how we cook now. And I did leave a little time for questions and answers. Most of the answers I won't have, but Ellen will if I don't. So the colonial era went from 1607 to 1776. 1607 being the first European settlers in Jamestown, Virginia. We know up here in Plymouth, Mass, the first ones were 1620. We remember from our history classes 100 years ago. And they were colonists until 1776, when we declared our independence and then became Americans rather than colonists anymore. That's a very long stretch of time, 170 years. So there's a lot of changes in that 170 years. And we will focus more on Joshua Babcock's time, which started in the latter part of the colonial period. 1734 is when he built the house. We'll talk a little bit about Westerly during that time. Westerly was actually established or first settled in the 1660s, and the Babcocks were the first family, or one of the first families in the town. By 69, it was an incorporated town, and by 1774, there was 1,784 people living in the town, including Dr. Babcock and part of his family. There were 9 of them living in the house at the time. Ellen found this colonial age and then the color. I thought it was interesting. And they must have gone house to house and just said how many people live here. This is obviously not the whole document. It was quite a number of pages. And it said no Indians.
There is an error, if you notice that it goes A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and.
I fixed it,
And the key goes,
I
oh, you
fixed
fixed it?
it.
Okay, I'm sorry,
So
Maureen.
there is no error. When we first looked at it, the columns didn't line up, but I kind of fixed that.
Okay,
So in 1734, Dr. Babcock was returned from London where he trained as a physician. He was 27 years old. His family lived in the Mesquamaket area of Westerly, and he wanted to have a house on the King's Road, which is what we know as Route 1 today. So he purchased a 200-acre farm that goes from where we're standing today, north to Tower Street, which is where Ellis is, over to 78, and then it actually goes a little bit past 78. Part of this swamp, which he called the Cedar Swamp, is part of his farm. And then down south to Wells Street, which is right here. And so it encompassed all of this area. It was a working farm when he purchased it, so there was already some stock animals on it. There was already some land cleared and fields planted for feeding the stock. That kind of overview, that's kind of the overview of what we looked like in the colonial age and what the period of time was. Now we'll look at what they ate and where they got it from. When they first came over here, they brought domesticated meat animals with them. So for protein, they had some domesticated meat animals, but a lot of the meat animals, they just brought breeding pairs. So they hung on to them for a couple of years until their herds got larger or their flocks got larger. They brought cows and sheep and pigs with them. Much of what they ate in the beginning was actually native game. So venison and moose and bears and rabbits and wild turkey and things of that nature. And the Native Americans actually helped them to find the areas that this game would segregate in, congregate in, and also to how to cook it and how to butcher them. Some of them we were familiar with from Europe, but not all of them. And they ate some seafood because they were by the shoreline. Mostly things they could get from the shoreline. They had only small boats, and they weren't really comfortable going out on our rocky shores in their small boats to fish. But they would catch round fish like a cod or a haddock and eat that. And a lot of shellfish. For fruits and vegetables, they again had to rely on the native fruits and vegetables. They brought seeds with them and rootstock, but they didn't survive the voyage or the first winter because they arrived in Plymouth in November and they couldn't plant crops that first year. So they had to rely on native plants. The beans on listing here are shelling beans or drying beans, so a kidney bean or a navy bean, that type of a bean, which they would bake typically. And then pumpkins and squash, and the squash are more of the winter squash like a Hubbard or an acorn squash, as well as tomatoes and corn. The beans not only were easy to grow and they were fairly prolific, they dried easily so they could be stored for quite some time, and they had a lot of protein in them, so they were filling. They were a really good addition to their diet. The original Pilgrims and original European settlers had a pretty high mortality rate for malnutrition and starvation. There just wasn't a ton of food for them to eat, and they didn't really know how to go out and get it. And finally, for fruits, there was cranberries, mulberries, and gooseberries around, and the Native Americans showed them where to find them, and so they ate those. And if you go to Ellen's cooking class, you'll make things out of cranberries. They did bring cows over with them, so they had some milk, and as the herds grew and they had excess milk, they finally, grains. When I think of grains, I think of wheat, because we use a lot of wheat flour, and that's what we bake with and make pies with. They were not able to grow wheat up here. There was a terrible rust, which is just a type of bacteria in the soil that destroyed the wheat crops. And the climate wasn't really suitable for it. So mostly what they used for baking was cornmeal, which comes from flint corn. Flint corn is just a very hard-shelled, dry kerneled corn that can be ground. If you see it now, they call it sometimes Johnny cake meal. So it's still grown, not a ton of it, but it's still grown around here and ground for meal. It comes typically in yellow or white. I use it to make cornbread with it. It's a nice product. And then finally they would grow rye. Rye grows well around here. If you see any hay fields around here, that's typically what they are. But they mostly used it for feeding the stock. It wasn't something they ground. When you get to Joshua's era, which starts like 1730s or so, food is a lot easier to get. It's a lot more plentiful. There's a lot more variety to it. They did not eat a lot of game by now because most of that game had been killed and it was very scarce and hard to find. They had built up their herds. They had imported other breeds and crossbred, so they had animals that were used to this climate. And they all had very large vegetable and herb gardens, very large. A lot of their time was spent with the vegetable and herb gardens, but they got more seeds in, so they were able to grow the vegetables they were more familiar with. They used a lot more herbs in their cooking than you would think, and more than we probably do today, both dried and fresh herbs. They had brought more trees over, rootstock over for apples and pears, so they had more fruit available to them. Wheat, barley, and rice is still very limited to be grown up here, but the southern colonies were able to grow it, and we traded with our southern colonies, and so we brought it up and had it here. At that time, in 1733, King George thought it would be a good idea to start taxing some of the foods. The first tax was the molasses tax in 1733. Our molasses all came from the West Indies. The West Indies had large sugarcane plantations and were able to provide the molasses at a good price. Apparently, you need molasses to distill rum, and apparently New England was pretty well known for their rum. So naturally, we got a little cranky when they started to tax it. So a fair amount of smuggling and bribing went on, but it made it much more difficult for us. In 1764, I believe, the Sugar Act came into place. Same type of a thing. Britain didn't like us getting our sugar and molasses from the West Indies because they didn't own the West Indies. They wanted it to come from their colonies. But from their colonies, it was a lot more expensive because there wasn't a huge supply. So they started to tax sugar. Sugar became prohibitively expensive. During that period of time, we looked for other sweetener sources. So honey started to come into play, and maple syrup, because you could use those in place of the molasses. I don't know that you can make rum out of it, but you could use it in place of molasses for sweetening. And finally, in 1773, the Tea Act came into play to tax tea, and we all know how that ended up for King George. Seemed like a good idea for him. Dr. Babcock died in 1783, and they did a very extensive inventory of what he had on hand when he died in order to split up the estate. I just put this in here because I thought it was kind of interesting what he had on hand for stock. And you're talking 100 plus years since the first European settlers came to the country, but he had everything: oxen, steer, horse, swine, sheep. He had everything, and this is just what was on Joshua's land. So I thought it was interesting, and I included it. Their meals were very similar to our meals. They had 3 meals a day, breakfast, dinner, and supper. Dinner is what we have for dinner now. They would have in the middle of the day, which really makes more sense. They had more time to prepare it ahead of time. It was typically had in the early afternoon, say 1 o'clock or so, and there would be meat, vegetable, some kind of bread, possibly dessert. If they entertained, and Dr. Babcock entertained quite a lot, there might be a soup course plus a dessert course. One more plug for Ellen. Ellen's meal includes a soup course and 2 desserts. And they likely had some type of bread for their starch. Maybe cornmeal, maybe cornbread, maybe Johnny cake, something of that nature. Breakfast was typically breads, porridges, that type of thing. But if you were a small farmer and you needed the extra energy to get through your day, you would have meat be included. But that meat was probably whatever was left in the kettle from the night before. It wasn't cooked that morning. It was, just here, eat this out of the pot, we got some leftovers. And supper, which they would have in the evening, would be leftovers or cheese and bread, something very light. They didn't eat quite a lot at night. This is Ellen's menu when she does her cooking class, and you can just see that there's three separate courses: the squash soup, skillet cornbread, the roast pork, all of which is delicious. And what I liked on the menu was she actually says, I keep thinking that you can see my hands on the screen. She says where it was cooked, what you cooked it in over flames or over coals, and what kind of a kettle you cooked it in. I liked that said that. And this comes from a character sketch by Dr. Wheaton, who lived with Joshua in 1779. Now Joshua at that point was 72. This lists what he ate at 72. I suspect what he ate when he was younger was quite a lot different. So his breakfast was bread and milk with some apple pie or fruit of the season. And Joshua himself would say, out of this porringer and this old spoon, I eat my bread and whatever. I've taken my breakfast for 40 years. This is a porringer. It's really just a bowl with a handle. This is not silver, this is pewter, and it comes from Ellen's collection. But I think it's pretty handy with that little handle like that. For dinner, he ate heartily and kept an excellent table, but always of one dish, be it roasted or boiled fish or flesh. And he drank cider and sometimes good wine. And supper, he would again have bread and milk. Not a very adventuresome eater, really. The difference between what they ate in those days and what we eat today, and how they cooked in those days versus what we eat today, really was that everything they ate, they did from scratch. They cooked it from scratch, but they also grew it. They planted the seed, they weeded the garden, they harvested it, they brought it in, they chopped it up, they cooked it up, all without the help of a KitchenAid stander or a stand mixer or a food processor, just knives and whatever. And that included the protein. If they butchered a cow, they gotta go off and get a hunk off of that to cook it up. So it was a very intensive cooking, and it was also quite seasonal. They ate what was available. A lot of the foods they had did not store well. Some of the vegetables would store, some of the meat would store, but a lot of it didn't store. So if you butchered a cow or killed a deer, that's what you ate until it was gone. There was no chicken one night and pork the next. It was pork until it's all gone in every fashion you can imagine. And if it was fall and the cranberries have ripened, you have cranberries at every meal. You're just gonna eat them while they're available. And Joshua's discussion here of his meal says that, fruit of the season. You can store apples and pears, but most berries are not really storable. So they ate them when they came up. And things in the vegetable garden, green beans and sweet corn and tomatoes, none of that could be stored at that time. So all of it had to be eaten as it came ripe. Okay, so I was gonna do originally, but when I started to think about it, I thought, well, I better talk about what we're actually cooking and eating before we talk about the differences between the kitchen. These two photos are from the keeping room in the museum house. I had to take two to get the whole keeping room in. And what I wanna ask you to do is think about your kitchen and then compare it to this and tell me what you don't see in this kitchen that you have in your kitchen. And I'm gonna write them on this flip chart and hopefully I'll write it in a way that people can actually read. Okay, show
Where's the
that.
microwave?
Okay, that was one of my first ones too.
Coffee maker.
A sink with water.
Ah,
Counter space.
wait a minute, wait. Coffee maker, okay,
Dishwasher.
okay, I'm gonna put that next to this sink.
Refrigerator.
Refrigerator.
Okay, that goes up here. Refrigerator. Shall we say freezer too? How's my handwriting, Harry? Pretty bad?
Oh, it's great.
It's legible.
Okay, oh, that's not it, keep going.
Stove.
Stove. Stove. And we'll say oven also, because most of us have them all in one appliance.
Counter space.
Counter space I have. You can't read it, but I have it.
I'll do it. Dishes and cups and sauces and
Okay.
serving places.
Dishes and cutlery,
Plates.
and, well, that's dishes. How about, a place to store the canned goods you bought, which,
Pantry.
No pantry.
which they don't have, but that's all right.
Well, Maureen, they do have a double deep basement. You know, there is one level below the basement level, there is an excavation there that was roof floored over. So it would be, you know, that would be 50-something degrees year round, but it wasn't a freezer.
Yep, and it's not a refrigerator, but close. I've actually included that, Ed.
But
It's a long way away from the kitchen though.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could have stored potatoes and things like that down there.
Yep. But it is, that's the other thing. When they're gonna cook a meal, okay, I wanna have potatoes and carrots and a piece of meat. They're not going to the refrigerator to get this. They're going out to the garden and picking the stupid tomatoes and the potatoes, and then they're coming in, and then they gotta go out wherever they keep the meat. It's not easy, it's an all-day thing. And that's why they have their big meals in the middle of the day, or one reason. They would have the time to prepare it. At breakfast, they just wanna get them out in the field, so they're just eating quickly whatever's left over. So I put these kind of in this order, just because that's how my slides are. And we're gonna start with the storage part of it, really. An ice house could be a freezer. Not every farm had one, but they would have them if they were a larger farm. I have a map at home from 1895, which has my house on it. And behind the house, on the property next door, there is an ice house. It's designated ice house, and you see that on the older maps. They're really just a structure that is very thick walled, typically stone around here, but they could be done of brick. And they're excavated underneath the ground to some degree. That helps with the insulation. They're insulated with straw or hay or whatever, and then you would get huge blocks of ice from around here, probably from the Pawcatuck River, and bring it up and stuff it into that ice house. There's an inner chamber where the meat or protein or whatever you want to store would be kept in this inner chamber. But the closer and tighter the ice is, the colder and the longer it will stay cold and not turn into water and make a big old mess. I didn't say this when I was talking about the farm earlier, but any farm, or really almost any property at that point in time, had to have a water source. They had to have a natural way to get water. They needed to, for their stock, they needed for them, you know, for bathing and washing, not that they did that much of it, and for cooking. So there was always a water source close to the farm or on the farm. But as I said, in the case of Dr. Babcock, if he likely came from the Pawcatuck River. Then, if you didn't necessarily have room for an ice house, or you didn't have a good ice source, you might have a spring house. Similar to an ice house, but really, the spring is their water source, and as water is running fast, it stays very cold, and you put that roof over the top and some walls on the side, and it keeps that little hut very cool because of the cold water going through it. Originally, they were built to keep the debris and leaves and animals out of the water source, and it's so hard to say, water source. That's what they were originally built for, but they now would store perishables in it. Maybe if you had some cider or some rum, maybe you put a bucket of that or a jug of that down right into the spring, and that will keep it nice and cold. Or you would store other perishables in there, probably dairy products, maybe fruits and vegetables. You could store some meat in there, but they likely didn't store a ton of it. So this I'm gonna call the refrigerator. This is their refrigerator. And to some degree, maybe their pantry, maybe because they kept some vegetables in there. A little cheaper to build than a nice house. And this is what Ed was talking about, a root cellar. So root cellars can be entirely separate buildings, or they can just be underneath the house. In the case of the museum house, as Ed mentioned, they removed a floor, but there's an excavation down underneath the caretaker's apartment that goes quite a ways down into the ground. Ground and dirt is like an insulator, so it keeps it cooler down there. And they would use it primarily to store fruits and vegetables, squashes and potatoes and carrots. You would want a very good airflow so that the vegetables didn't dry out too bad, but you don't want them to be too wet because then they rot. So it's kind of a fine line to keep it just the right temperature and just the right amount of humidity, but it needs a really good airflow. You still see structures like this around, and there's kind of been a resurgence of people building root cellars. So I'm gonna call that kind of the pantry, kind of the refrigerator. But again, this is, unless you're at Dr. Babcock's house, this is typically not right in the house. Typically, you're walking out onto the property to get to your root cellar to bring in whatever you need. They would also store some grain in here, so they might store flint corn in here, they might store cornmeal in here. And then the last thing under this section is really not storage, it's more of preserving. The Native Americans taught the settlers to smoke their meat. Smoked meat is cured as opposed to cooked. I don't really understand the whole difference, but first you brine it for 8 to 10 days, and then you smoke it or dry it for another 2 to 3 weeks. It preserves the meat like ham or bacon, although you have to put bacon, we put both of them in the refrigerator. But once they're properly cured, they can be left out in the air. When they first learned to do it, they just made a big outside fire pit with a rack above it. And the Native Americans used to slice the meat very thinly and put it on that rack and let the smoke cure it. And that's like jerky, it comes out like jerky or even pepperoni for that matter. And they taught them to do that. It's good to travel, it's something you can put into your pocket and go somewhere with it. In the colonial times, probably in Joshua's age, it could be hung very high in the chimney. Or I have heard and seen photos of a separate chamber in the attic of the colonial home and a small window or whatever you want to call it in the chimney that's going by that, and the smoke comes in and it's cured right in the house. It does take quite a long time, but it allows you to keep it for a long time. Okay, so now we have all our meat and it's in our refrigerator or freezer or ice house. Then we'll talk about cooking on the hearth. This is the same photo from the hearth in the museum. The hearth is really all of these things. It's it's the microwave, not the sink, not the counter space. It's the microwave, it's the coffee maker, it's the stove, it's the oven, it's all of that in one. It's the Instapot, it's the toaster oven, it's any of that is what that hearth is. They cooked as much over, they didn't cook as much over flames. Mostly the cooking is done over hot coals, which takes quite a lot of experience to get it in the right, the coals and the pots and pans in the right place, close enough to the coals. Maybe you need to take the coals away. We have a dial on our stove or oven that says, I want it to be at 350 or I want it to be at medium. They learned to move the coals closer or farther away from whatever they were cooking in order to maintain that temperature to be the right size. I have some samples here. Most of these are from the museum of the things that they would cook with. Hold on, I think I have pictures. Yeah. So kettles are these big, huge things, and they are typically cooked over a crane, which I don't have a good picture of, but a crane is just a metal bar stuck on the side of the hearth, but it pivots, and you would hook the pots to it with S-hooks. You could have various sizes of the S-hooks, depending on if you wanted the kettle closer to the flame or higher up to keep it cooler, to have it not boil so quickly. You could hook a couple of hooks together, and you hook it on the crane pivots toward you, you put that big heavy pot on it, you put your stuff in it, you stir it around, and then you push it back over the flame. So that you're not completely catching yourself on fire. So this is a kettle, and then on the bottom picture, see if I can do this with a mouse, this is this, which is the coolest invention ever. Let me see if I can lift it up. Okay, it pivots, like I don't know how, this thing turns. So you hang this on the crane by an S-hook, and then you put all your flapjack batter on this side, and you turn it around, and you put it on the other side, so you can pivot it on and off of the flame, which I think is very clever. This goes on the ground, on the floor of the hearth. It has feet, but it does the same thing, it turns. So you could grill, it's like a grill, you could grill meat on it, but you can turn it to get it over hotter coals or cooler coals, depending on if it's cooking too quickly. These, I think I have, yeah, oh. The Dutch oven I didn't have a picture of, and I don't have one here. This is the photo of it. I have 2 Dutch ovens, I cook with them all the time. They're very good for cooking. Mine don't have the feet on the bottom. And the lid, you'll notice, has got like a, whoops, oh dear, hang on, has got like a lip on it. So you put your biscuit dough in the bottom of the Dutch oven, you stick it over the coals, that's what the feet are for, and then you let it bake. And if it's not baking quickly enough on the top, and your top is still raw, you put coals in the top, and it brings the heat down on top of it. So that helps the top of the biscuit or whatever you're cooking in there to get cooked. These were actually called bake ovens. They were most often used for baking. I use them more for stews and chilies. I do bake bread in them, but mostly for stews and chilies, but they used them more for baking. And then these are spiders, which we have a couple up here. This is a smaller one. Same thing with the feet. So the feet go on top of the coals. And if it's boiling too fast, you just drag a few of the coals out from underneath it. And it's got a nice long handle. Ellen, what did they have for pot holders? Where is Ellen? What did they have for pot holders?
Well, the idea of that long handle is that the handle doesn't get wet.
hot.
But I would assume they, I don't know the answer to that, Maureen, but, because I have to use the barbecue stuff.
Yes,
when I
yeah,
do it.
because you don't want to
But,
burn yourself.
But I would assume that they would wrap a dish towel,
Or
a
something
rag around it, yeah, and that's called a posnet, P-O-S-N-E-T, which is different from your kettle or your
Okay.
pot.
It's not called a spider?
Your spider is the,
More like a frying pan?
Yep.
Okay, so this is a real spider, thank you, Ellen. And this is more like your frying pan that you're gonna saute in or cook something quickly in. And again, it has the feet, so it can go right over the coals.
I think spider's close enough, Maureen, because
we'll
it's
just call
just
it
the diameter of it, that's
Okay.
all. Has the 3 legs and the tail.
Yep. Oh, and then these are spatulas, and our spatulas are plastic or wood or whatever. These are made of cast iron, and you can tell that they've been forged. They're kind of hammered out look to them. And then this, which again I don't have a picture of, but this is Ellen's. This is what they would bake bread pudding in.
Can't see, oh, the redware.
They would bake bread pudding or something of that nature in. And then Ellen has one of these, but I didn't bring it out here. We don't have one at the museum. This is the coolest invention ever, the tin reflector oven. It's like a half of a big circle or a big barrel, and it's made of tin. It's got a spit in it. This has a spit in it so that you stick your roast or your turkey or your chicken on there so it can churn as it cooks. But I think of it like a convection oven because that tin reflects the heat back at the meat so that meat cooks more quickly. When I went to Ellen's house and did the hearth cooking class, we did a pork roast and it was probably 4 or 5 pounds. It cooked in an hour, maybe an hour and a half at the most because of that heat coming off of the fire. You obviously put the open part towards the flame, and then the back part has that kind of nifty little door so you can open it up. Are you done yet? And in this day and age, we'd stick a thermometer in the meat, but in those days, they just looked at it and said, I think it's done.
Does it talk back to you?
Yeah.
And then food preparation. So all of these things, counter space, well, counter space really, and sink and dishwasher. So the sink and dishwasher, no, there's no running water in the house. There's buckets of water from the spring house or the water source they have, and that all has to be brought in anytime you're gonna cook with any kind of water. But all the chopping and dicing and mixing and measuring and all that happens at the little round table in the middle of the room. And once they're done doing all that and everything's in the pot and cooking, they take everything off, they wipe it or don't wipe it down, and that's where they eat dinner. But it's all done at that table, which when I look at that makes my back hurt just thinking about it. Because you're leaning over, or if you're sitting, you're raising your arms up. It's not ergonomically correct. And the cupboard in the side, on the side of the picture, I guess it's a cupboard, Ed? I would call it a cupboard, right?
Hutch.
Like a hutch. That's really what they have for storage. They don't, and so your pots go with your dishes and your cutlery would go in there, and maybe on the bottom you would have other dishes. They didn't have a ton of dishes. They might have one for each person if you're lucky. The inventory of Joshua's estate listed 10 knives and 10 forks. So if there were 11 people for dinner, you're sharing a knife and a fork. And the early colonial days, they maybe brought a few dishes with them, but they would eat out of a wooden trencher. And it's just a piece of wood that's hollowed out, and there might be 2 or 3 of you eating out of that same trencher without necessarily any utensils. You might just be picking it up with your fingers. I'm assuming they used something better than that to get it out of the pot because it was hot, but they did not have a ton of chinaware or cutlery even for that matter.
You know, Maureen, it might be worth mentioning because we do refer to the house as a mansion, and Joshua was not typical. Evidence of the structure of the house indicates that there was a door from the keeping room into what we call the parlor. So Ike Smith always felt that that parlor was where any formal, like supper, the midday meal would have been held in there. And when Ben Franklin was visiting, they would entertain him in that dining room at the front of the house, the nicer room, you know. But again, it doesn't change any of the preparation stuff. It's just they wouldn't have to watch whoever was doing all that work, which would not have been Joshua or his wife, I'm sure.
Yes, it is worthwhile to point out that Joshua had some money, so they lived a little richer than other people. And they probably had more china
That's why he had more than one knife and fork.
Yes, they didn't have to share. So the stove is kind of the hearth, and then the oven is the beehive oven in the back. I don't know if you can see it. Come on, Nels. Right out back here, that's the beehive oven. They called it a beehive because the top is domed, which helps with the heat transference. And Ellen actually stuck her head in that the other day to make sure that it really was domed, it really was a beehive oven.
And you notice, well, I
Go.
don't want to short, this was very dangerous.
Oh, yes, I
The
forgot to
place,
say
are
that.
you gonna talk about that?
I forgot.
Well, this is very dangerous because you have to, lean over the fire, if you've got a fire going to get to your oven. So just about the time you're talking about 1775, they began to put that beehive oven outside or on the side of
Or on
the.
the side.
Yeah.
So you weren't walking through the open flames.
Right.
The other thing I meant to say as I started to talk about the hearth was they didn't allow the fires to go out. There was no such thing as matches. You had to do the Boy Scout method of rubbing two sticks together, if that has ever worked, or the flint thing where you hit it on a rock to get a spark. So that fire was always going, 365 days a year. They did not allow it to go
And
out.
can you imagine cooking in that kitchen in August with that fire going 24/7?
I expect it was a little warm. I'm pretty sure they didn't have fans or air conditioning, pretty sure.
And we know there was a summer kitchen, but we don't know how far back the summer kitchen went in time.
Well, we did, Hugh found a plan that it looked like Ike did, and it looked like that got added in 1858 maybe. I'm looking for Harry. Harry, remember, do you remember? But it was not there when Joshua was there, it was later. They did have a summer kitchen. So to cook in the beehive oven, you have to put the coals in there 2 to 6 hours ahead of time. And then you put coals in there and you cover up that opening with a piece of metal or a piece of board, and you let those bricks really heat up. And then you take the metal off and you put in whatever you're trying to bake. They did a lot of baked beans, so they would put those way in the back because they took a long time and they didn't want to have to get around them or move them every time they wanted to take in a pie or bread or whatever. They did have, just like a modern pizza place, they did have a peel, but it's made out of metal. So it's not light, but it would go into that, you can see the end of it sticking out of the oven in that photo. So it would go into the fireplace, into the oven to take out breads and whatnot. Let's see, I'm gonna come to the front. This is the crane I was speaking of. So this pivots so that you can pull the pots off the flames or not. And Ellen can correct me if I'm wrong, they did not cook a ton over open flames. It was primarily over the coals is what they would cook over. This is all I really ever say. Oh, so then because I bake a lot, I make a lot of my own breads, I make my own pasta, I do a lot of baking. I started to wonder about leavening agents. So when you make bread, you need yeast. When you make cakes and cookies, you need baking soda or baking powder. No such thing as baking powder. They did have something sort of like baking soda, and it was a natural product. Something had to be done to it to kind of activate it and make it usable. I couldn't quite figure out what they were talking about, so. And then yeast. So, I go to King Arthur Flour and I buy a pound of yeast and it lasts me all year. I said, wonder where they got their yeast from. Ellen's had a cookbook that had a recipe for yeast. I was so excited. And the first ingredient is yeast. So, but really what they did was they made a starter. Just like sourdough is going around now, it's kind of a fashion, or it became a fashion again during COVID, where you make a starter. So you make this stuff with yeast and flour and water, and you let it bubble up. You let it yeast does is it breaks down the gluten in the flour, and that makes it the flour airier, and it makes your bread airier. So what they did, once they got something started, and flour or wheat flour has a natural bacteria similar to yeast in it. My oldest sister, Elizabeth, was in China for the Peace Corps for a couple of years, and she loves bread, but Chinese people don't eat bread, and they don't have any yeast there for sale at all. So someone told her, just add water to the flour and let it sit and see what happens. And by God, after a couple of days, it started to develop something similar to a sourdough starter. So you make the bread, but you hold back some of the starter, and you just keep feeding it with more flour and more water, and then you just use that over and over again.
You know, Maureen, years back when that was kind of in fashion, we started doing that, you know, somebody said, and we were doing it. The problem is, you can't eat all the bread you're gonna make. Because, you know, you've gotta use it, you can't, that starter doesn't last forever.
It doesn't last forever. And we would keep it in the refrigerator probably, starter, to keep it slowed down a little bit. You know, they're not gonna take it out to their spring house, they're gonna just leave it in the kitchen. They didn't know anything about bacteria, they had no knowledge of bacteria. So they didn't know that letting stuff sit around and get kind of funky is not good for you. They mostly found out by trial and error. Oh, I ate that roast and I don't feel very good. Maybe I shouldn't eat that meat anymore. It's been in the spring house for 3 weeks. They didn't know about that. It was a lot of trial and error. This is from that same inventory of Joshua's estate, and it's just the stuff they had in the kitchen. And this is what I mentioned: 11 knives and forks. Then it does say 10 ditto, which I don't know what that means. A round table, a square table. I just thought it was interesting. This was all the stuff they had in the catalog. Now, did we get everything? Oh, I forgot to talk about the counter space, kind of. The counter space really was the table. They didn't have counter space. Did I get everything else? Coffee maker, I don't know that they had coffee.
Yeah, there's a coffee pot.
Oh, they do have a coffee pot, you're right. So I'm sure it was just cast iron and got stuck in the, on the hearth.
The ditto probably means it's the thing above, but so they had 11 knives and forks, and then they had 10 of the different knives and forks apparently.
So they actually, well, this was Joshua, they had a lot of cutlery. They didn't have to share.
I'm sure everybody has a scummer.
Yeah. Well, you probably need one.
If it is what it sounds like, it's very handy to have. You know, it really is. It takes the fat off the top of your chili if
Yes.
you want it.
Skimmer.
Yeah, skimmer.
What's a water plate?
I don't know. Ellen?
No, I don't know either.
I don't know.
What was the question?
What's a water plate?
Oh.
It was a bell metal kettle. A metal kettle, like, oh, metal, I wonder if they mean metal like iron.
Oh, good for you.
And that was all I had.
That's wonderful.
So, any questions?
I was gonna ask you, when did we start canning and preserving?
Not until, I did a talk on canning, you'd think I'd remember. Not till the middle to later part of the 1800s. The jars were difficult to make, and then the whole sealing thing kind of threw them for a loop. They had to do quite a lot of research in order to get that to work.
Yeah, sort of had to understand the bacteria was a problem.
They did, yes, they did, and that was really the whole purpose of the canning, was to kill that bacteria and then seal it so no more got in. And that was in the 1800s that Pasteur maybe discovered bacteria.
Yeah, well, one comment, when I did research years ago about early westerly, one of the things I learned was that the Pawcatuck River was loaded with salmon. And that the farmers had their houses usually on the banks of the river. and that they did a lot of fishing for the salmon.
Oh,
and
out of
Pawcatuck
the, out of the river would be much easier.
Yeah, I mean, cause they
realize
lived on the riverbank.
Yeah.
But it said that that the river was just full of salmon in the colonial days.
They probably netted them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes, Mike was right, they probably
Yeah.
lived in nets. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, the western was three fish.
Oh, that's right, that's the fish,
Yeah.
yep. Anybody else?
When you think about changing tastes, we lived in Virginia for a short while, and of course Colonial Jamestown and all that. Lobster, which we think is pretty special, was reserved for the Native Americans and, you know, anybody who, the people who could afford anything, they didn't want the lobster, which sort of has gone 180 degrees up. The other thing is, even in my lifetime, we can all remember seasonal foods. Right now, we can buy berries all year round, because they're not coming from here, they're coming from South America or Chile or somewhere like that. But, I mean, that's a relatively recent innovation. I guess it's the shipping of produce like that somehow.
Flying.
They fly it, or
Yeah, they fly it.
I don't think they
refrigerated
fly it
places.
all. I really think they've got ways with containers that it comes on ships.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, loaded with nitrogen. I don't know what they do.
It's
We
a
don't wanna
gas.
probably know what they do.
Yeah.
But it's changed our diet, hasn't it? I mean,
Absolutely.
Electricity didn't come into play until the 1920s, so you really couldn't have a refrigerator or a freezer until you had power for them. First you had to invent how to keep things cold, but you had to have power for them.
we had a nice box.
When I was a little girl, there was an ice making place down on the river, somewhere near where that new museum is.
Yep.
Down in that area, and as a little girl, so I don't remember exactly where it was, but there was an ice place, and my father would go down there and buy a big hunk of ice.
Yeah.
That was an ice house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they produced it, but,
Yeah, that's exactly where it was.
yeah,
Just
Yes,
past
that's where
the
they.
cove.
yeah, down in that area, yeah. Yeah, I remember going there with my dad
Sometimes if
in
you
the
were having
olden days.